I'll start.
You want to start?
Yeah.
You can see this is highly disciplined and structured, which is the way I always like to do things, as those of you who remember my time in government will recall. I'm going to ask Ayelet to start, and we're basically going to have about 5 minutes by way of general commentary. You can stretch it a little bit, and then Peter will also start, and then I'm going to have some questions for them, and I hope a bit of a dialogue and conversation. So go ahead, Ayelet.
So first of all, I want to say thank you for having me. It's a delight to be in Canada and Toronto, and to be a part of an NIF event. I'm a huge supporter of the NIF. I feel a little bit of a fraud on the stage, quite honestly, because this event is titled, has the word courage in it, and we have seen our day began with an example of such astonishing courage. What Mutassim has not just survived and thrived in his life makes me not feel like I can possibly use the same word to describe what I do. I am in awe of you. I am so grateful for what you have allowed Israel to do, which is welcome you and to show that it is possible it is possible for Israel to be the country that it wants to be if it only follows the leadership example that you provide. So thank you. And I look forward to the book that I know you will write someday soon. So I'll tell you a little bit about this volume, Kingdom of Olives and Ash, that my husband and I co-edited. It began, I was born in Israel. My family's from Montreal. My dad made Aliyah, and actually in the audience today is someone who was at Baron Bing with my father in the same class. My dad made Aliyah before you could really make Aliyah, because it was before there was a state of Israel. So he moved before the War of Independence, and then came back on Shlichut to Montreal, met my mother and brought her back in the 60s, and I was born in Jerusalem, although we very quickly returned to Montreal and then eventually moved to the United States. So I only spent a couple of years as a baby in Jerusalem, and then returned over and over again throughout my life. When I met my husband in 1992, I said to him, you're not really going to be able to understand me unless you come to Israel, because that's such a huge part of my life and what it means to be a member of my family. So the very first thing we did was go into Israel. And then we didn't go back for decades. Not on purpose. We weren't boycotting. It was just that as every year passed and the political situation in Israel grew worse and worse, I couldn't align my own moral compass and my own political beliefs with Israel. My engagement, I'm still a Jewish, I went to synagogue, I still supported Israel, I still made my donations, I'm the daughter of a fundraiser, you can bet I filled the pushki box, but I couldn't bring my children to Israel. Not on purpose, but there were years that we bought tickets, and then something always came up. And finally, after more than 20 years, I was invited to Mishkanot Sha'ananim in Jerusalem to be part of a literary festival. And honestly, I was just flattered. It was ego that brought me to Israel, because when I had been a student at the Hebrew University, Mishkanot Sha'ananim was where the writers and artists stayed, and it was the idea that I would be invited to be in this place flattered my ego. So I said yes, and got on a plane, and it was only when I was on the plane that I realized that I hadn't actually been back to Israel in decades. While I was at Mishkanot Sha'ananim, while I was participating in this literary festival, I decided that the only way that I could really do this was if I called a friend of mine who I had met through NIF, who was part of the organization called Breaking the Silence, and asked him to take me. I didn't even know really what I wanted. I just said, Avner, show me something that I need to see. And he said, all right, I'll show you something. And he picked me and a couple of other writers up, Nam Lee, who's an Australian writer, and a fellow novelist from Germany. And he took us to Hebron. I had never been to Hebron. If I knew about Hebron, I knew about the massacre early in the 20th century. I knew there was a large settlement. I knew there was an outpost, but that was sort of the extent of my knowledge. What I didn't know was, for example, that one of the main market streets in Hebron, a Palestinian city, a street called Shuada Street, is what's known in Israeli military parlance as a sterile street. What does that mean? Shuada Street is a street on which Palestinians are not allowed to step. Jews can walk on Shuada Street. Individuals who hold foreign passports can walk on Shuada Street. But Palestinians are not permitted to walk on Shuada Street. Even the Palestinians who own homes and businesses on Shuada Street. So the Israeli military has sealed off every storefront with metal bars, and the people who live on the street have to climb in through their back gardens to get into their homes. And you can imagine, eventually most of those homes, one at a time, are being abandoned. I had never seen a more dramatic and striking exemplification of the political situation in the occupied territories than I did at that moment when I was standing in the middle of a Palestinian city by virtue of my Israeli passport in the middle of a Palestinian, in the middle of a street, watching as at the top of that street, two young Palestinian boys who lived on that street hovered, looking down the block at me, and raised their feet as if to step, to take this illegal, terrifying action of stepping on Shuada Street. I was terrified. I was terrified they would be shot. There, in the city of Hebron, there are 850 very, very radical Israeli settlers guarded by 650 Israeli soldiers. And I looked at the soldiers who were there, and I looked at these two young boys, and I had this moment where I thought, I am going to witness these boys getting killed for doing this thing, stepping on the street where they live. The Israeli soldiers rushed the boys, they pushed them away, nobody was hurt. But at that moment, I decided that my disengagement was an act of privilege that I was no longer willing to tolerate. And my disengagement from the situation in Israel and Palestine was something that I had to make up for. I then went to Tel Aviv, where I'm sure many of you have been, and I had a great time. Tel Aviv, awesome, amazing, gay-friendly, great cafes, wonderful boutiques, a tremendous literary and artistic community. I went out at night with my friend Edgar Carrot. We got drunk and smoked pot, and I was, reliving it was wonderful. I was behaving like a 22-year-old. I was out at 3 a.m. I have 4 kids. Usually I'm in bed by 8:15. And then I thought, oh, now you're really screwed, because now you have to do something. Because the problem is that you feel happy here. The problem is that you feel a sense of belonging here. And if you belong to a place, then its crimes are your crimes. And that's when my husband and I decided to bring all of these writers to the West Bank and Gaza to give them the chance to see what was going on there and simply write whatever they wanted. There was no political litmus test. We just said, write the essay that you feel moved to write. And we collected those essays. The proceeds of the book go to benefit Breaking the Silence and to benefit a nonviolent Palestinian peace organization called Youth Against Settlements. And I think I've gone on far longer than my 5 minutes, so I'll turn over to Peter now.
Peter, thank you.
Borrow your microphone. There we go. Okay.
It's nice and warm.
Thank you. Well, I also just want to echo what an honor it is to be speaking after Mutasem and to echo what Ayelet said, which is that, for me, courage is not getting invited to a Shabbat lunch because someone from my kid's day school or our shul doesn't like what I say about Israel. That's not courage. If I have any role, and it's to support the people who really show courage. It's to use the opportunities and the relative ease and privilege that I have through no virtue of my own to support the Israelis and Palestinians that I, like Ayelet, have had the privilege to know, who inspire me by willing to take great risks for the future of their society. As long as they are willing to continue that fight, it seems to me that those of us here in the diaspora have no right to abandon them, no right to let them down. It's one of the, I thought a number of things as I was listening to Mutasem, and one of the things was that this is certainly true in the US, I would imagine is Canada as well. American Jewish organizations would love to have Mutasem come and speak, so they could celebrate Israel, right? They would love to showcase the fact that Israel gave refugee asylum to an African immigrant, so they could boast about how great Israeli democracy is. What they will not do, is fight for him. What they will not do is fight for Israeli democracy. This, to me, in some ways, is the moral catastrophe of organized American Jewish life. The willingness to boast about Israeli democracy, but not to fight for Israeli democracy. That's why the boasting gets every year more and more hollow. Because in fact, it's boasting about something that American Jewish organizations don't actually value. They value it as a propaganda talking point. They value it as a way of trying to lord it over Israel's adversaries. But they don't actually care about it because they're not actually willing to sacrifice anything for it, because that would put them in conflict with the Israeli government. And tragically, this tendency to celebrate democracy in the abstract, but turn your back as it deteriorates around you is a feature of organized American Jewish life that it turns out not only to be the definitional of the way our Jewish organizations deal with Israel, but also the United States as well. Because some American Jewish organizations have issued press releases about some of the things that Donald Trump has done, about the refugee ban, about the banning of people from 7 Muslim majority countries. But if you look at the resources, the passion, the effort that was put into fighting the Iran deal, a deal, parenthetically, that many in the Israeli security establishment actually think has been good for the state of Israel, and you compare that to the amount of energy and passion that's been made by many Jewish organizations. Now there are exceptions to fight against Trump's agenda. You see that actually oftentimes the commitment to American democracy is as thin as the commitment to Israeli democracy. Donald Trump was able to go to speak and get repeated standing ovations at AIPAC, the most powerful American Jewish organization, because he was willing to come and give the same set of empty platitudes that every other candidate offers when they go to AIPAC, and that's all that AIPAC ultimately cared about, right? What Donald Trump was going to do, what Donald Trump was going to do to American society, the country in which the people in that room actually lived, was ultimately irrelevant to AIPAC's judgment of Donald Trump. If AIPAC if Donald Trump had been a serious critic of the state of Israel, he would not have been given that platform. But because he was willing to mouth the same empty platitudes as all of the other candidates, the fact that he represents the most profound threat to liberal democracy in the United States of any president of our lifetimes was considered irrelevant by the most powerful American Jewish organization. So what does it say to our fellow Americans that the most powerful American Jewish organization feels that it has a responsibility for the state of Israel, but doesn't actually take any moral responsibility for the country in which the members of that organization actually live? Right? That seems to me also at the root of the moral catastrophe that is organized American Jewish life in the Trump-Netanyahu era. The last thing I wanted to say is that I was thinking as Mutasem was talking, there's this strange line in this week's Parsha in Kitavo about that an Aramean tried to kill our father. It's a weird line. The rabbis tried to interpret it. It's the line from which you may be familiar with the line because it's taken in the Haggadah. This weird claim, and the rabbis then are puzzling about this. What could it mean to suggest that the Aramean, who's interpreted as Lavan, right, that Lavan was a greater threat than Pharaoh? Right? I mean, Lavan was a trickster, he was a cheat, he wasn't the most upstanding of people, but how could you possibly suggest that Lavan was a greater threat to Yaakov than Pharaoh was when he enslaved the Jewish people and tried to kill the Jewish male firstborn? So one interpretation is that Pharaoh represented the threat of subjugation, and Yaakov's experience in living with Lavan represented the threat of prosperity. Right? A different kind of threat, maybe a more insidious threat. Not the threat of being attacked yourself, but the threat of living in a world of where you were prosperous, but where there was no morality. Right? The same reason that Abraham decided to go to the less fertile area and let his nephew Lot go to Sodom, right? Because of the recognition in Torah that there's a threat to going and living and being privileged and prosperous in a place that has no ethics, in a place that has no morality. That maybe that actually even could be the greater threat than living in a place where you yourself are victimized. And we are in a world today where Jews are victimized, where there are threats, in some ways renewed threats of anti-Semitism. But it's important. But we also very much, I think, live in the world that the rabbis feared that Lavan represented for Yaakov, which is a world in which, by virtue of our relative privilege, as people in the United States who are for the most part, considered white, who are well integrated into the United States, who are no longer requiring refugee status very, very much, that we can become morally corrupted by the privilege and prosperity that we have been given. And that seems to me a really central challenge of American Jewish life today, both vis-a-vis Israel and vis-a-vis the United States. And it's that challenge that I think the New Israel Fund fights against, to remind us that it says 36 times in the Torah that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, that we were forged as a people in slavery, right? Rabbi David Ingber has an interesting commentary where he asks, why did the Jews have to go to Egypt at all? After all, in Genesis and Bereshit, they're already in the land of Israel itself. Why this huge detour through the land of Egypt? And he says maybe it was that we did not want Jews to establish sovereignty without having tasted slavery first, so we would always remember it when we had power. I think this question of how Jews act with power, which is a relatively new challenge historically in Jewish life, not one we had to wrestle with for 2,000 years, is really one that is being posed very, very profoundly for this moment. And I'm very, very privileged to be connected to a Jewish organization that actually tries to meet that challenge in a way that I think gives honor to the best ideals of Jewish tradition. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you both to Ayelet and to Peter for those very powerful words. It's my job to moderate a dialogue between you. I'm not sure exactly what there is to moderate, but let me try and start by asking a question that I'm often asked, and that is, when you consider the worst cases of human rights abuse around the world, the horrific number of brutal dictatorships that exist, where do you rank the current situation in Israel in that hierarchy of wrong? And Is there a risk that you're focusing too much attention on, Israel's problems and challenges and what's wrong with Israel in comparison with all the other areas in which there needs to be attention paid? How do you square that circle, or is it a circle to be squared?
I think the first question you ask is, why do you rank? I mean, why are we comparing human rights crises? Why are we comparing human rights violations? Here, I do prison reform work in the United States. American prisons aren't as bad, I think, as prisons in, Iran, perhaps Myanmar. But does that mean that I should just say to the millions and millions of people who live under horrific conditions in American prisons, things would be worse if you were in, Myanmar? No, I mean, you as a citizen of a country, as a citizen of the world, as an individual tied to different places, you assume the burdens, I think, of your own personal affiliations. And so for me, that's because I live in the United States. I work on various human rights issues in the United States. And because I'm a Jew, and because Israel exists as a Jewish state right now, I also feel obligated to assume the burdens of, and to say to assume the burden is to be so self-aggrandizing. It is important to me to speak out about the human violations committed in the name of all Jews. I mean, as long as Israel exists as a state that is overtly Jewish, every action done is done in the name of all of us. Do you have a better answer, Peter? Because you've been preaching so beautifully this morning. I feel
you're going to
totally barn burn that one.
Unfortunately, I completely agree. And I feel like, if you really think about the question, I just think it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, if you, people are allowed to be passionately concerned about particular issues that speak to them, right? I mean, if you say that you're concerned, that you're terrible, you're involved in animal welfare, right? Because you're concerned about abuse of animals, do people turn to you and say, well, shouldn't you be more concerned about the climate change, because that's a bigger issue, right? I mean, when American Jews...
My mother does, but,
Your mother, all right. When American Jews organized to free Jews who were being persecuted in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, when they were protesting against and boycotting, by the way, protesting the Bolshoi Ballet when the Bolshoi Ballet came to New York, for instance. Did people come up to them and say, the Soviet Union's treatment of Jews is not nearly as bad as the Khmer Rouge genocide or what Idi Amin is doing in Uganda? So you're really practicing a double standard here. You should be more focused on those things. They would have said, well, yeah, but we're Jews. So we feel a special obligation to our people. And I think that's part of what Ayelet was saying. That would be the same answer I would give. I'm a Jew. I feel a special obligation to my people. My children's future will be far more profoundly impacted by what happens in the world's only Jewish state than what happens in Burma, even though what happens in Burma is probably worse. And I believe, you can think I'm wrong, but I believe that what I'm doing is profoundly in the best interest of my people. In fact, because I believe that Israel's survival as a democracy is crucial to Israel's survival, period. I don't think Israel will ultimately survive as a non-democratic Jewish state. I think it will go the way of the last Jewish experiments in sovereignty, which we know from our texts collapsed more because of internal moral corruption than they did because of foreign threat. So I think, and for an American to answer that question, I think the answer can be the United States gives more foreign aid to Israel than any other country, more than double the second largest recipient, and that most of the other countries that we would consider worst human rights abusers in the Israels in the Middle East are not only not receiving aid from the United States, but they're either being sanctioned by the United States or being bombed by the United States. So it may well be true, and I think it is true, that Iran, Syria, a whole series of other regimes are worse than Israel, but America is not implicated in their human rights abuses in the same way, because we are actually adversaries of those regimes, whereas we are Israel's primary protector and benefactor. And so it seems to me an American has a right to ask about the use of their tax dollars and whether those tax dollars are being used to do things that they believe are that are morally right and that are in America's interest.
And you as Canadians can, just because you have this sort of moral superiority that Peter and I both envy you so very much because of the virtue of, which side of the border your grandparents ended up on. You lucky things, you.
I think most of us feel that our moral superiority is being challenged these days. So that's a good good reminder. So what I hear you both saying is that the thing that motivates your writing and your passion and your advocacy has a lot to do with your affirmation of Jewish values. Is that right?
Yes. I think Peter knows a lot more about Tanakh than I do.
He knows a lot more about everything.
Everything. Everything.
That's a given. Now let's just move on.
But for me, I think the sort of the defining experience of Judaism is Jewish guilt, right? And I was raised with this idea of tikkun olam, and I know many of you were, which is that my obligation as a Jew is to engage in a kind of sometimes easy, sometimes more difficult practice of trying to repair the world in which we live and to do our bit. Of course, there was also the message that as important as it was to do good in the world, it was also important to do well in the world. But this idea that you have to use your privilege, that you can only tolerate your privilege if you are engaged, in whatever small way, with repairing the world is I think is a very Jewish feeling, and that is definitely what drives, I think, all of the different work that I do. And it's certainly the lesson. When I teach my children those lessons, I teach them in a Jewish way. I mean, that's the way I imbue Judaism in my children, because we're not religious. So, when we light the Shabbos candles, when we have a Seder, what we talk about is injustice and our obligations in repairing that. And the Holocaust, which is, the other sort of defining experience, particularly of all Jews, but also of American Jews.
Peter.
I certainly agree with that. I think that I do think that we live at a time when we are aware. Certainly, people of my age are aware of the way in which the creation of the State of Israel changed what it meant to be a Jew for every Jew in the world. It was a kind of transformative experience of what it meant to be Jewish, to go from, being part of 2,000 years of homelessness to there being a Jewish state. And we know what the experience of 67 meant for so many people, to see that Jewish state be able to defend itself and survive when many thought that there might be a kind of second Holocaust-like experience. And what I think about for myself and my kids is, what's the opposite of that? What does it mean to be a Jew who lives through the destruction of a Jewish state? For me, the most likely way that Israel will cease to exist as a Jewish state is because of its moral collapse. Ultimately, I simply don't. And what's interesting is this may sound like a kind of woolly, kind of soft-headed perspective, but this is actually very much what the former leaders of Shin Bet and Mossad have been saying in recent years. If you watch The Gatekeepers and look at what people like Yuval Diskin and Meir Dagan have been saying, is that this is really the greatest existential threat to the state of Israel, greater existential threat than Iran, for instance, or even Hamas or Hezbollah, although those represent threats. That it's simply not tenable in 2017 to be a colonial state. It may be for a while, but ultimately, democracy is what gives you legitimacy. And any non-democratic regime is a regime that's living on borrowed time. And if Israel becomes a country that is permanently holding millions of Palestinians in the West Bank as subjects but not citizens, under the control of the Israeli government, but with no ability to become citizens of the Israeli government, that's the definition of colonialism. That's what colonialism means, is to be the subject of a state that you cannot become the citizen of. And if that becomes Israel's permanent reality in the West Bank, we already see how that seeps back across the Green Line and fuels so much of the anti-democratic, illiberal ugliness that Mutassim talked about, and that we see that the New Israel Fund has been the ugly recipient of. And so I think about, what would it mean for myself and my children to say that on our watch, that our parents or grandparents were the generation that was privileged to witness Israel's birth, and that we were the generation that on our watch saw Israel's death. I think that will haunt us till the end of our days, if our generation or our children's generation allows that. And so that's my version of why I'm part of this.
Thank you, Peter. I've had a question being placed on my table saying, why is Mutassim not part of this conversation? Which I actually think is a very good question. So what I'm going to suggest is I'll have one or two more questions for our two guests, and then I'm going to shift ground and bring Mutassim up here, and then I'm going to shift the conversation over. And I think that's going to be a good way to go. Peter's last answer really allows me to shift ground to what is sort of the big political question, which becomes increasingly difficult and elusive and almost hard to imagine. Tragically hard to imagine, but let me bring it up again. It's not an issue that we deal with directly in the New Israel Fund, but obviously it affects a lot of what we do. I would really appreciate hearing from both of you on your perspective on the viability of the two-state solution, what possible alternatives there might be to it, and where in your, if you ever allow yourself a positive moment, where does that positive moment take you? Or is this just dreaming in Technicolor?
So I'm going to deflect that question, and I'm going to say that I think there's, there are two issues in my mind generally. One is the issue of occupation, and one is the issue you can largely call the issue of conflict. And the two-state, one-state, binational state, those questions are questions of conflict. And I don't feel competent to posit answers to issues around the conflict. I think Peter is much more competent in that sense. So I focus my energies simply on the issue of occupation. And there are not two sides to the question of occupation. There's not, it's not one side, shall we continue this occupation indefinitely? That's not a legitimate answer. Occupation has to end, period. It's a very simple and thus comfortable place for me because my activism is around the issue of the illegal, under international law, the illegal occupation of millions of Palestinians by the military government of Israel. So, Peter, with that, I will let you draw a picture of a future, perhaps.
Okay. Before I say that, I just want to, because I may not get this opportunity to say, I wanted to just say something about Kingdom of Olives and Ash, and to just say something about what I particularly appreciate about the book, which I think is connected to the larger themes here, which is that I love the fact that Ayelet and Michael wrote this book from a Jewish place, but then invited all of these authors from around the world, most of whom were not Jewish, also to comment. Because it seems to me that's a beautiful model about the way we should have this conversation, is that Ayelet and I may speak from a Jewish place, and many of you may speak from a Jewish place, but it's very important to say that just because that's our motivation does not mean that people who are not Jewish and don't come from that place, therefore don't have the right to speak. That in fact, often they can shed light, given their perspective and their equities, that may be valuable in different ways. And I just love the idea, because too often, I think what happens in the United States is the American Jewish community essentially tries to hold ownership of the Israel conversation and in various ways keep non-Jews out of it. They don't care enough, they don't know enough, we don't really trust their motives. Anyway, I love the book as a different model. Look, I support the two-state solution for two reasons. The first is a tribal reason, a particular reason, right? Which is that in a post-Holocaust world, and in a world where, as we see, anti-Semitism has this bizarre resilience to it and can emerge kind of when and where you least expect it, I like the idea and that there is one state in the world that has a special obligation to the protection of Jewish life, that exists. Maybe I'm more influenced than I should be by the experience of my grandmother, who had to live in many different places because of the vulnerability of the world in which she grew up. But I don't totally feel comfortable, even though living in the Upper West Side of Manhattan in 2017, I feel pretty secure, to say that we now know with certainty that this is not needed for Jews. Certainly Jews in France, I think, would probably have many more questions about that. And as we've said, even in the United States, we can be surprised in unhappy ways. So that's the tribal answer. I would not expect that answer to be compelling to a Palestinian. It's a Jewish tribal answer, but I'm not a pure universalist. I also speak out of a concern for the security of my own people, just as I focus on the concern of my own family, even though that sometimes might come at the expense of others. The second, so the question partly becomes the question like that Martin Buber posed, essentially, what's the minimum damage, the minimum injustice possible necessary to safeguard myself? And I think what Ayelet was rightly saying is that the controlling the West Bank is absolutely not necessary for the survival of the State of Israel and the survival of the Jewish people. In fact, it's a threat to the survival of the State of Israel. I also think the two-state solution is rooted in a recognition that this is not only a conflict of individual rights between Israelis and Palestinians, but it's a clash of rival nationalisms. That there is a deep desire among Israeli Jews for national self-determination and a very deep desire among Palestinians for national self-determination. Not only to have individual representation, but to have national representation. Some people, liberals, leftists may say that's archaic, why should, that's atavistic, but we're not seeing a world, if you look at the Middle East, or even if you look at Europe, where nationalism seems like it's becoming a thing of the past. Nationalism is very much something whose enduring power is very, very, very real, and it's very real in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is why the polls still show that the two-state solution is more popular among both Israeli Jews and Palestinians than any other alternative. And that there's actually surprisingly little support, at least the polling would suggest, for some kind of one-state, binational state on both sides of the Green Line. That said, and I'll just stop here, that those of us who support the two-state solution have to guard against the possibility that we end up that the two-state solution becomes used as a tool of moral complacency, which is to say, I respect those people who say Palestinians must gain the rights that they deserve, and we're not willing to wait for that to be held hostage to any particular political circumstance. Which is to say, I still support the two-state solution. I still think it's the most viable solution, but we have to be honest that the more we accept with complacency Israel's occupation of the West Bank, and the more we accept with complacently Israel creating more and more facts on the ground that make a Palestinian state impossible, the more we ourselves will be the authors of the one-state solution that we oppose. We will be the ones, as much as anyone else, who will have brought that about. And if we don't want to bring that about, therefore it is incumbent upon us not just to say we support the two-state solution, as Jewish organizations say they support Israeli democracy, but actually to fight for it in opposition to the Israeli government.